Well, figure today is a good day to remind people about the impending economic calamity that I have been talking about really since I started this channel. It's been my main focus, other than, overseas wars. And it's a topic that I've neglected a bit with all the election stuff going on. I've neglected it a lot, frankly. Um, Partially because, there is so much news about the election that I think is very much worth covering. But also because the between the Federal Reserve and the federal government, they've done a lot to stifle the collapse of our economy, but they have in no way prevented it or stopped it or resolved it. They essentially hit the pause button back in March. And something that I discussed quite a bit back then when the concept of the lockdowns were first raised, but it's something that is worth revisiting right now because it's been so long since I've brought it up, is that you can't just do these lockdowns and actually hit the pause button on the economy and then expect when you hit play again, when you decide to open everything back up, that things just go back to normal. Especially, the longer that it goes on. What I mean by that is that when you decide to just shut down the economy, you're destroying, our economic engine. These businesses can't just freeze in place. They have to continue operating, or else, they lose money and they go under. And we've seen that, en masse throughout the United States this year. Businesses are constantly going under. And some of the some bigger stuff, like, so for example, the housing market hasn't gone under. You would think, well, all these businesses are being destroyed. Wouldn't these people lose their houses? Well, no, because the federal government has the forbearance program, and interest rates keep going lower, so people can actually refinance and get lower payments and these things. There's lots of ways to stay in your house. If you lose your job, and there's the big welfare payments that are supposed to be supplemented by the CARES Act and such. But none of this has done anything to preserve the structure of our economy. And so that means that as soon as these various welfare measures expire, then we go back into economic freefall, which, essentially, it's really hard for me to say that we're not already there. I mean, the economy has not been good this year. GDP numbers have been okay, but, nobody's actually doing well. And, this year is a good example of why I don't like GDP as a measure. GDP doesn't mean that you have a good economy and that people are doing well in life. It doesn't mean that at all. GDP just means that there's money being spent. So I was reading this story. It was published originally at Bloomberg and it's picked up by Zero Hedge and I think a couple other places about the coming dark winter with regards to the housing market. Bloomberg put together this map using census data showing the percentage of adults in each state who are living in a household where there's a delinquency in the rent or the mortgage, and that eviction or foreclosure is likely in the next 2 months. And this was a heat map of sorts. It's a little bit of a tortured figure. The percentage of adults living in a household. It's not the percentage of households, which is what you would expect, or maybe it just was written in a way that wasn't very clear. So, like in a couple of places, like Nevada, Arkansas, and Florida, Zero Hedge mentions the percentage of households that are delinquent is over 50%. But I'm not sure if they mean the percentage of adults and whatever. So I'm just going to call it households overall. I'm not exactly sure if that's correct, but it should. The figures should line up somewhat evenly. And the exact figures aren't really a big issue. The point is that in a lot of states, nearly half of the population is delinquent on their housing payments, whether that be rent or mortgage. And that means that without the forbearance program, which is expiring at the end of this year, which people can renew for an additional 3 months, I believe, although they have to go ahead and do that themselves. If they don't know that they have to apply, then they're going to lose their forbearance no matter what. so almost half the population in many states is at risk of losing their housing. And so this would be a big upset in the housing market that has, throughout this whole year, not slowed down a bit. In fact, in where I live, I've seen more construction going on in 2020 than in the 3 years previous. I mean, it seems, and again, this is anecdotal, that they just stepped on the gas. But this really is happening all across the country, and particularly, of course, in Florida, Texas, and these other states where you have lots of people moving. I'm sure Georgia as well. They had to move in a lot of those suburbanites to vote for Joe Biden. It takes a lot of gated communities to flip Georgia blue, or at least come close enough to where you can steal it for the blue side. But this crisis is going to occur at some point, no matter who's president. At some point, especially after the vaccine and things stop, we're going to have to move on from the year of lockdowns, and there's no way to do that smoothly. Things necessarily will get much worse economically before they get better again. As bad as it might be in some areas, the firefighters, so to speak, have come and tried to extinguish every little wildfire that they can over this past year. And so just like what we see in California with their wildfires, when the California Forestry Service, never lets any of their forests burn, you get all this kindling that just piles up and piles up over all of 2020, and that's going to ignite into, the hottest economic fire you've ever seen. And it is going to burn down much of what is still standing, economically speaking, in the United States. Our economy has been teetering on the brink of collapse for quite some time, and the Fed has put a floor in it. The federal government, when the Fed was not enough this year to stop the economy from collapsing because of, the lockdowns, that was really it. The federal government had to come in and try and bail out everyone by saying you don't have to pay rent or your mortgage. But the people who haven't had the ability to pay their rent or their mortgage since March are not suddenly going to get that ability back anytime soon. So I think it can be pretty certain that no matter who gets into office, whether that be Trump or Biden, there's going to be an additional bailout program put forward for this sort of thing, an extension at the very least of what we've seen, or perhaps in time things get crazy enough, because this has been nuts for so many reasons this year. At this point, I wouldn't put it past them just saying, "Oh, we're going to forgive all the federal mortgage debt," because really, if you don't do that, there's no way to avoid the collapse. And of course, if you forgive federal mortgage debt, the precedent of that, you would destroy the market forever. There's no good options here. Is what I'm trying to say. I don't see any path that we can go to where things get better at this point. The best thing that could happen is if a responsible person gets in there and says, "Gee, things are really screwed up. We have to let this market crash. We have to let the air come out of the bubble. We need to let things burn, and then we'll grow back stronger." Nobody has the stomach for that. We live in the participation trophy society, and obviously, a lot of these people should blame their mayors and governors for the lockdowns and things, for destroying their businesses, for taking away their ability to house their families, to pay for their living expenses. But it's just a reality at this point that nobody can afford to pay these things. There's much more debt in the system. I've been saying this for years. There's way more debt in the system than can ever be paid back. So at some point, people have to default. Housing prices have to collapse so that people can afford housing again. If you just forgive everyone's debt, if you just keep kicking the can down the road and saying people don't have to pay, prices will never go down. It's just like the whole student loan thing. College was affordable before student loans. It's only because student loans are so readily available that that increases your demand for college to such an extent that it sends prices through the roof. And the same thing is true with housing, with making home loans so cheap and easily obtained. And I mean cheap in terms of the interest rate. All this has done is drive up prices to the point where nobody can afford their housing right now. Even if they do have a job, they probably are not making enough money to pay what they were paying before. And the prices overall in the market need to come down to reflect that. The consumers of housing overall cannot afford as much as they did before. And so the response to that is not that 40% of adults will be homeless. That's not what it will happen at all. What will happen is that prices will come down to a place where they can afford it. Because people are not going to leave these houses empty. The houses are going to be filled. Somebody's going to buy them. It's just a matter of at what price. But the process of getting there is very painful, because the process of getting there at this point means that there's going to, mass evictions, mass foreclosures, and it's only when you have that sudden surge in the supply of available housing that's for sale and for rent that prices will collapse. Because if every apartment complex in town evicts 80% of their tenants at once, well, they're going to be pretty desperate to attract new tenants. The landlords will have a lot of competition, and the same will be true to people trying to sell their homes. If everyone's trying to sell their home at once, if the banks foreclose a bunch like they did last time and try and dump all those houses onto the market, it's going to, again, send prices plummeting, which is what should happen. The prices shouldn't have been this high to begin with. They're only this high because of the Fed, just like stocks and bonds, as I've explained time and time again. But given that it's almost certainly not going to happen, I don't see how a Biden or a Trump presidency just lets things collapse like they should. They're going to continue the program of forbearance or whatever in perpetuity. So where do we end up eventually? Do we just end up, I guess we end up possibly at the Great Reset, to where nobody owns anything because nobody can afford anything, right? And we can't let anybody get evicted, so the government could just decide, okay, we're going to monopolize housing. I think that's too extreme to get done too. That's probably more extreme than that's probably more unlikely than just letting everyone foreclose. So I guess I don't know at this point. Where do we go from here? I guess I'll ask you folks to leave your thoughts in the comments if you have any ideas on which way this could go. As I've said, I know what should be done. The only way out of this situation. I've made that perfectly clear. But what actually will happen? Maybe at this point what will happen is the federal government will just introduce their Yang Gang universal basic income, send everybody a check every month, and just leave it like that. Make the check so big that people can afford their housing. Of course, again, that will just lead to housing prices going higher. But at that point, if we get to that point, then we're in monetary endgame zone at that point. If the Fed is just printing money, quote unquote, loaning it to the federal government, and the federal government's just handing it out to people like candy, then the dollar's not going to last too long. That to me sounds like a more likely scenario, as sad as it is, than just letting the housing market adjust to this new reality. So I guess we just have to keep an eye on this, watch as it continues to develop. But things are not getting better. Don't let anybody fool you into that. Things are only going to get worse, and they have to get much, much worse before they ever get better. And frankly, I don't think that anyone will let it get bad enough to actually improve. So I'll leave it there. If you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.